Hello, I'm Paula Blair. Thank you for joining me for another in my film and audiovisual cultures lectures. Just a reminder to subscribe so that you never miss a new video release. These lectures are released every other Wednesday and they're in the gap weeks between when my podcast comes out. And if you subscribe to this channel, you'll get everything I do. So you'll get at least one thing a week. Following on from our session on Andy Warhol and pop art last time, in this lecture I'm looking at the films of Kenneth Anger and notions around popular culture, the mythical and the queer. Anger fits alongside and perhaps would normally in canonical works would be aligned with psychodrama and personal films. So the likes of what we were looking at with Maya Deren and Stan Brakhage. But Anger is also out in his own without category as well. Given that Anger began his filmmaking career dealing with his personal situation as a young gay man at a time when being gay was illegal and highly taboo, I think it's interesting to resituate him in what I've been trying to do with these lessons and shaking up the accepted canon with others presenting and dealing with issues of gender and sexuality that all contribute towards broader notions of identity. We touched on this a tiny bit with Andy Warhol and we'll be looking at it in more depth when we come to Shirley Clarke in the next session and her film Portrait of Jason. I think it's also useful to turn to more accessible notions of narrative after the dismissal and disruptions of narrative that we've seen in the Flux films and Chelsea Girls. So if narrativity, ritual and psychodrama, if those kinds of topics are of more interest to you, do consider Anger in relation to Deren and Brakhage and so on. You know, it's good to be reminded of all of that before delving into the visual abstraction of structuralism we are going to come to. And that does not fully reject or resist narrative in the way the Flux films do, even though they have the seeds of structuralism in them. But it's also good to bear in mind that Anger's filmmaking evokes the relationship with the European as well as the American avant-garde and aspects of popular culture. For me anyway, watching his work, there are some stirrings of what we would come later to think of as mashup and convergence culture. Kenneth Wilbur Engelmeyer was born on the 3rd of February 1927. He changed his name when he left home. He grew up in Hollywood and was surrounded by the film industry during one of its idyllic and happiest decades in the 1930s. He acted in many mainstream films as a child and even began making his own at around the age of 10. He was very close to his maternal grandmother, but not so much to the rest of his family. She had been a costumer during Hollywood's silent era and regaled him with stories, leading to his lifelong interest with that period, quite possibly with dressing up as well. She bought him his first 16mm camera second-hand, and it had been used in the Second World War, and he made his film Fireworks with it in 1947. His grandmother was also a painter and he assisted her. She had made money in real estate and was the only person who helped him financially early on. Anger drew controversy because of his interest and his cinematic explorations into the psychosexual. He was also interested in mythology, the occult and ritual. He was accused often of being a Satanist, but he was interested really in the visuality and display of the occult, and he wasn't a practitioner of it. It's more about the surface image of it. Prints of a lot of his early films are lost. It seems that lab technicians deemed them obscene and would destroy them. It's not that there was sexual content, they weren't pornographic, but he would film the naked male body quite a lot. Anger never considered himself as part of a group or a movement, and his films are very individualized. They're distinctive. They set apart from what other people were doing. You can draw some comparisons very broadly, but that's really about it. He was a good friend to many affiliated with art and film across the United States and Europe. He lived with Mary Mencken and Willard Mass for a while in New York City. Mass was gay, but was in a relationship with Mencken and they had a son together. Perhaps it's possible that he was bisexual, but he's described as gay in any literature, so I don't know if that's by erasure or it was a semblance of a heteronormative life for safety. I don't know. Unfortunately, in this module anyway, I didn't manage to look at Mary Mencken and Willard Mass. They come up a bit, I think, in the Flux films, and they're mentioned quite a lot with other people's work, and sometimes they feature in other people's work. Mary Mencken, she may actually be in Chelsea Girls briefly, so they were part of that crowd, and Kenneth Anger was more of a West Coaster, but like so many of these people would end up spending time in New York as well, because that was where a lot of really exciting and very different things were happening. We're going to look at Anger's films across 3 decades, the 1940s, the 1950s and the 1960s. In the Suárez reading that will be listed below in the references with the title Pop Queer Fascist, that article questions Anger's identity as a filmmaker, and we can look at 5 films to tackle the same question. And these films were Fireworks from 1947, Puce Moment from 1949, Rabbit's Moon from 1950, Eaux 1953, and Scorpio Rising from 1964. Anger's focuses change with age, although his interest in silent film traditions emerges consistently throughout his whole oeuvre. But soundtrack is very important to him. He had extensive use of music, and it was usually a mixture of classical and popular and contemporary music, and this really comes to a head in Scorpio Rising. Very much it's a very pop culture type film, and a lot of the sequences in it play out like music videos. It's one of those films where it's almost like a precursor to what would become the music video. Fireworks in 1947 is a particularly interesting film. It's not Anger's first film, but it's probably the first of his films that are available for study. He claimed that he was 17 when he made it in 1947, but he was actually 20. It's interesting because there are histories of Anger that are written with the assumption that he's telling the truth, so that he's younger, and so timelines don't always correlate, so that's something to bear in mind if you go off and start reading about this. He was born in 1927. Fireworks was made over a weekend in his home when his parents were away. He was the youngest of 3 children and the last to remain at home, and he left soon after this. It's thought to be, I haven't heard any updates on this, but it is thought to be the first openly gay American film. It was a precursor for queer cinema and even Warhol's Blowjob, which was 1964. It was controversial because homosexuality, same-sex relationships were outlawed. It was illegal for men to be in a relationship and to have sex together. Anger lied about his age to exacerbate the shock. He wanted more of a shock factor, so it was a bit more radical that a 17-year-old would make this rather than a 20-year-old. And interestingly, his octogenarian grandmother was highly supportive and thought the film was terrific. It can be described as a trance film that was possibly influenced by Maya Deren's Meshes of the Afternoon from 1943. They never actually met in person, but they did correspond through letters. Those are films that are really very interesting to look at in comparison, because they're both about characters who fall asleep and have quite violent dreams, and his is much more overtly sexual. There's the use of symbols, objects that could be read as symbols. So if you go back to the video on Deren, you can probably have a bit of a think about that and do a bit of compare and contrast there. Alongside this, Fireworks helped to define psychodrama as a mode of filmmaking, an instance of a film driving a theory and a way of reading film. Scott MacDonald states that a psychodrama is, quote, a film that uses symbolic action and detail to dramatize a disturbed state of mind, usually the filmmaker's own, unquote. Fireworks is psychosexual. It explores Anger's awakening of homosexual desire, and not just this in itself, but within a highly heterosexual American society where his sexuality is criminalized. At the time, he didn't realize the significance of this. It was just something he wanted to do, and it has a really dark humor. He's trying to push some buttons, but I don't think he comprehended just how radical the film would be as we look back on it. The gravity of it became clear when he tried to get it printed. It was almost confiscated by the lab in Hollywood. I suppose just to note for any younger 21st century viewers, when you were filming on film, you had a negative, so you had to get it printed, you had to get it developed in a laboratory to get the positive film from it. The head of the lab was a Navy veteran, and the film depicts Anger's dream self encountering a group of sailors. The film was saved by a lab assistant who convinced his boss that the film was of no importance, and there was no need for the Federal Bureau of Investigation to become involved in the case. It was just a piece of trash. It was a kid messing about. The film was altered by Anger many times. What we watched in class was the final version that was first released on video in 1986, almost 4 decades after it was made. Early screenings drew unexpected interest from Hollywood directors and from Alfred Kinsey, who was a biologist who conducted research into human sexuality, which began the field of sexology and identified a scale of sexuality, so something more like a spectrum. Alfred Kinsey viewed the film and requested interviews with Anger, and the data that Anger brought were part of Kinsey's breakthrough study published in 1948 called Sexual Behaviour in the Human Male, and there was a female follow-up in 1953. The two remained good friends until Kinsey's death in 1956. Puce Moment is a short made out of unfinished footage of a longer film, Puce Woman. It depicts a woman trying on 1920s flapper gowns, and these belong to Anger's grandmother. The film evokes early silent cinema by using alternating camera speeds. Again, although this is the visual aesthetic Anger tries to attain, the soundtrack here is really interesting for its incongruity. Originally, it was classical, it was Verdi, but Anger re-released it with a new folk rock soundtrack in the 1960s. I think this is a good point to remember that these films are not fixed in the way a lot of Hollywood films are. I suppose we're thinking probably along the lines of director's cuts possibly, but I think all of these versions will be to some extent director's cuts, because it was more of an individual artist working on something but tweaking it over time. I suppose a bit like Meshes of the Afternoon again where it was completely silent in its original iteration, and then much later it had a soundtrack added. Rabbit's Moon was filmed in 1950, but it was not really completed or released properly until 1972. So we screened the second version of the film that Anger re-released in 1979, which is sped up and uses a different soundtrack from the original, which was a loop of British rock band Raincoats' It Came in the Night. It was filmed using a blue filter and it was set in a forest at night. The narrative involves a clown, Piero, who yearns to capture the moon. In the story, the moon is inhabited by a rabbit, a mythological concept from Japan. He never manages to reach it, and to make matters worse, another clown, Harlequin, appears and teases Piero by showing him Columbina, with whom he hopelessly falls in love. In contrast to most avant-garde or experimental filmmakers, Anger never made the assumption that his films were marginal. He found that his films were largely being seen by American Film Society audiences, and he very much wanted to broaden that. Some Europeans had got hold of fireworks, and significantly Jean Cocteau in France, who is probably a very important name if you're going to think about the French and the European avant-garde. Anger had sent a print for entry into a film festival of banned and problematic films and won a prize for poetic film, and Cocteau had been the head judge. He invited Anger to France, and Anger went in 1950 and stayed there for about 12 years. He was an assistant to Henri Langlois, apologies for my terrible pronunciation, who again is another really integral name to do with French cinema of any kind, because he was the founder of the Cinémathèque Française and was a French film archivist and cinephile who was very well known. Eau d'Artifice was from that period, unsurprisingly. Anger met with a constant struggle for funding. He made money from a book on Hollywood scandal called Hollywood Babylon, which was first published in French in 1959, then came English editions in 1975 and 1981, then part 2 was released in 1984. His films were inexpensive in commercial terms, but they were more expensive than most avant-garde films because they involved sets and costumes, more elaborate music, and probably more elaborate lighting setups. So much of what we've looked at so far has been very ad hoc and very homemade, quite literally, whereas Anger, he needed sets and actors and that sort of thing. When Anger managed to make them, his films were luscious, they were distinct and very memorable. I haven't seen these films for years, and they're probably the ones that stick most in my mind, I think, were probably Anger's and Darren's and Shirley Clark's. The films constantly evoke his quite spiritual quest, for want of a better term, to use cinema as a means to acknowledge and honour and even take part in spiritual traditions that have been suppressed by society as it has evolved. So this is something that's not religious. I think it's probably more tapping into the human is probably what is meant here when he's trying to find spiritual traditions, because he's really concerned with ritual and the things that humans do. And this is what we see in Eau d'Artifice in 1953. It depicts the Villa d'Este in the Alban Hills in the east of Rome. And this is a tourist attraction, so there were shooting restrictions. The emphasis was on the elaborate fountain system. It brings to life mythical figures in the sculptures spouting water and incarnates the spirit of the garden. A tiny woman appears from a fountain and moves around the enchanted space and then dissolves back into a fountain. Later films such as Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome and Lucifer Rising mix figures from many mythological traditions. This relates to the idea that our conventional surface lives can rupture at any moment to reveal the subconscious or repressed forces that inform our experiences. And these ruptures can alter our perception of the world around us. The film's title plays on the French for fireworks, so feu d'artifice, and eau d'artifice means water of artifice, fake waters. So there's a referring back and forward here, and it's quite elemental. The soundtrack makes use of the winter movement from Vivaldi's Four Seasons. The idea had been that Anger wanted to do all 4 of the seasonal movements in 4 different gardens around Europe, but he didn't have enough money and so ended up moving back to the US. Scorpio Rising in 1963 is probably Anger's best known film. It's a depiction and an interpretation of a biker gang. It particularly emphasises rituals, so the spiritual dimensions of the group's fascination with their bikes and the sense of ownership and liberty that the bikes represent. The film presents their preparation for a Halloween party and the final bike race of the year. It can be quite an ambiguous film to watch. There is tension between the glamorization and condemnation of commodity items such as motorcycles and the culture that they imply, the sorts of people involved in this. The film is presented in 13 segments. It is suffused with pop culture icons and references. It's used to comment on biker subculture. The soundtrack entirely consists of popular music from the time. It often accompanies the bikers and it can provide ironic commentary on the activities seen on screen. This is thought to have been one of several films using this technique that, as I said earlier, were the genesis of music videos that would emerge in these decades. But I think specifically not just the music videos where it's a band performing, but music videos where it's something that's not necessarily to do with the song being depicted. Scorpio is the zodiac sign that rules machines, death and sex. This notion appears alongside religious implications. 12 is the magic number. 12 is the Greco-Roman pantheon. It's how our year is divided. It's divisible by 2, 3, 4 and 6. It's quite a special number, and of course it has religious implications in Christianity with the amount of disciples who followed Jesus, but also it's edging into how those acts of following can evolve into something dangerous and even unseemly. There is a clear relation throughout the film between mortality and immortality. These are people who are living fast, hard, short lives, but they develop this cult-like status so that they'll always be remembered in some way. There is a lot of Nazi imagery attached to these people. There's a sense of it's quite a fascist group of people. You have to follow their rules. Their rules break everybody else's rules, but you have to follow their rules. You have to be the same as them. There's a lot going on here regarding identity attributed to a group, to a mass, and as well as this, the momentum drops. It's about preparation and anticipation. So much of the film is about getting ready for something. It's the excitement leading up to the event, and then the actual event becomes an anticlimax. So all of the excitement was in the pre-event, with all the leather posing and emphasis on the body, so the male body and the bike chassis. There is a strong sense of homoeroticism, but it's really ambiguous. And we're left wondering whether the homoerotic element is Anger's gaze on these men, or it's actually coming from relations between the gang members. All the participants seem to be heterosexual. They seem to be misogynists. There's a lot of pin-ups on walls, but from this homosocial environment, is there also a form of eroticism? Because there's so much in the film about watching them dress and prepare and have a certain look about them, and that's applied to how they work with their machines as well, how they work with the bikes. There's something almost edging into sexual in how they prepare their bikes as well as their own bodies. And so that's probably the film of Anger's that has probably had the most lasting impact, the biggest legacy. Anger has made more recent films since the 1980s, but they really don't get much recognition. So when I had last checked, he was still quite active when I he gave this lecture in 2013. His last film had been in 2010. He was still giving talks on all of his work. There were lots of versions of his different films on YouTube as well. Just if you're watching his films and you want to study them, motifs to look out for include costuming, dressing up, adorning with jewellery, pointed use of music, use of lighting, bold colours, popular culture, recognisable icons. He made very personal films, as has come up quite a lot so far in these cinema and the American avant-garde videos. In his case, it wasn't even necessarily about him personally always, but it was more about topics that interested or moved him. And the films are full of oppositions and ambiguity. The questions that I left with my students when I first gave this lecture, and then I think this was quite a short lecture because we had a lot of films to screen that day. In what ways is fireworks significant? So the repression of sexuality in society and Hollywood's complicity of this. How reactions against that repression might emerge in the subconscious, in the dream state, the notion of psychodrama and relations to modernism. Can contrasts be identified between Anger's films made in America and those he made in Europe? So there you could think about repression versus a degree of freedom. Through filmmaking, does he find freedom in a repressive society, or does he enjoy freedom in a more accepting society? And yet he has less money when he goes to Europe, so does that curtail him? And there's a lot of things to think through there, I think, in terms of how much liberty does one even have when making films? How subjective is the homoeroticism in Scorpio Rising? Is it Anger who projects his inference on the bikers' society and lifestyle, or is it emanating from them? What different kinds of desire can be discerned throughout the films, because it's not necessarily limited to a sexual desire. So that's it for that one. I really enjoy Kenneth Anger's films, and I hope if you manage to track any down and watch them, I hope you get something out of them too. There's an awful lot of detail that can be gone into on any one of these films, and this was a very brief overview and an introduction to his work. So I do encourage you to go off and read and to check out some of the references that are down below. Thanks so much for watching. If you're interested in the work that I do, I have a blog over on peablair.blogspot.com, and I make Audiovisual Cultures podcast, which you will also be able to access on this channel, as well as all good podcast providers. If you can support this work at all, there are links down below. A $5 over at buymeacoffee.com/PEA Blair would be amazing. It would really help me out so much. But please subscribe and do share with anyone else you think will find this useful. Until next time, take it easy.